I'll take 3 of the durian and these grapes if the price is right.
Deal.
Deal.
It is the best price you will find today, I promise you.
The morning came cold and quiet, but the mountain air carried a weight that Jack could feel deep in his chest. It was his first real day, not as a CEO, not as a man with power, but as someone who had to earn every single coin, just to survive. Jack stood outside the small wooden house, staring at the old motorbike parked beside the fence. The same bike he had used to come here, rusty, worn, barely holding together. Behind him, Tien stepped out, holding a small basket filled with fruits. Some survived from the storm, others gathered from neighbors who had quietly offered help. "These are all we have for today," she said softly. Jack turned, looking at the basket. It wasn't much. A few oranges, some guavas, a handful of wild vegetables tied together carefully. Back in the city, this wouldn't even be considered pocket change, but here, this was everything. Jack took a deep breath and walked toward her. "I'll sell them," he said. Tien hesitated. "You've never done this before." "I've never lost everything before either," Jack replied with a faint smile. She didn't smile back. Her eyes were filled with worry. "The road is long," she said, "and dangerous after the storm. You should wait a few more days." Jack shook his head. "If we wait, we don't eat." Simple, brutal, true. Tien lowered her gaze. She knew he was right. Slowly, she stepped closer and adjusted the strap holding the basket to the back of the bike, her fingers lingering a little longer than necessary. "Be careful," she whispered. Jack gently held her hand. "I will." Their eyes met. There was no need for more words. Jack got on the bike, kicked the engine alive, and took one last look at her. Then he rode off. The road down the mountain was worse than he remembered. Mud covered most of the path, turning it into a slippery, unpredictable trail. Sharp turns hugged the edges of steep cliffs, where one mistake could mean disappearing into the abyss below. Jack gripped the handlebars tightly. The wind cut across his face. The bike shook with every bump, but he didn't slow down, not because he was fearless, but because he had no choice. At one sharp turn, the rear wheel suddenly slipped. The bike tilted dangerously. Jack's heart jumped. For a split second, everything froze. Then he slammed his foot down, stabilizing the bike just enough to regain control. He exhaled sharply. Focus! He couldn't afford to mess up. Not today, not ever again. By the time Jack reached the district market, the sun was already high. The place was loud, crowded, chaotic. Vendors shouted over each other, trying to attract buyers. The smell of fresh produce mixed with sweat and dust filled the air. Jack parked his bike awkwardly at the edge, clearly out of place. He untied the basket and looked around, unsure. This was a different battlefield. No suits, no contracts, no negotiations in glass offices, just raw survival. He picked a small empty spot on the ground and laid out the fruits carefully, trying to make them look as appealing as possible. For a while, nothing happened. People walked past him, ignored him. Some glanced briefly, then moved on. Jack swallowed. Then finally, a woman stopped. "How much for the oranges?" she asked casually. Jack hesitated. He had no idea what the price should be. He quickly recalled what Tien had mentioned the night before. 20,000 per kilo." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Too expensive." Before he could respond, she waved her hand dismissively. "I'll take all of it for half the price." Jack frowned. "That's too low." "Then don't sell," she interrupted coldly, already turning away. Panic hit him. If he didn't sell, the fruits would spoil. If they spoiled, today would be for nothing. "Wait," he said quickly. The woman stopped. Jack clenched his jaw. "Fine." She smirked slightly. "Good." As she took the fruits and handed him the money, Jack felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't negotiation. This was being crushed, and he knew it. But he accepted it anyway, because survival didn't care about pride. Hours passed. Jack managed to sell some more items, but each deal felt like a loss. People bargained aggressively. Some even mocked him. New guy, huh? You don't know the market at all. You'll starve like this. Their words stung more than he expected. But Jack didn't respond. He just kept selling, kept enduring, because every coin mattered. By late afternoon, dark clouds began to gather again. The market slowly grew restless. Rain's coming, someone muttered. Jack looked up. The sky had turned heavy and gray. A familiar unease settled in his stomach. He quickly packed whatever was left and tied it back onto the bike. Then the rain came. Suddenly. Violently. Within seconds, the ground turned slick. Water poured down, soaking everything. Jack tried to shield the remaining fruits with his body, but it was useless. They were getting ruined. Again. Damn it! He bit his lip, frustration rising. Not again, not after everything. But there was no time to dwell. He had to go back, now. The road up the mountain was even more dangerous in the rain. Visibility dropped. The path became a slippery nightmare. Jack rode slowly at first, trying to stay in control, but the rain kept intensifying. At one narrow turn, a truck suddenly appeared from the opposite direction, its headlights blinding through the rain. Jack's eyes widened. There was barely enough space. The edge of the road dropped straight into darkness. Shit! He pulled the brake. Too hard. The bike skidded violently. The rear wheel lost grip. Time slowed. The world tilted. Jack felt the bike slipping out from under him, his body thrown sideways, the edge of the cliff just inches away. The world spun violently. For a split second, Jack felt weightless, like the ground had disappeared beneath him. The bike slid sideways, its tires screaming against the wet, muddy road. The edge of the cliff loomed just inches away, hidden beneath a curtain of rain and mist. No! Instinct took over. Jack twisted his body, throwing all his weight to the opposite side. His left foot slammed hard into the ground, scraping painfully against rocks as he fought to regain balance. The handlebars shook uncontrollably. The engine roared. The bike tilted, then stopped. Half a meter. That was all that separated him from the abyss. Jack froze. His breath came in sharp, broken gasps. Rain poured down his face, mixing with sweat, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. For a long moment, he didn't move. Couldn't move. Then slowly, he turned his head. Behind him, the dark void of the cliff. In front of him, the narrow, trembling road. He swallowed hard. I almost died. The realization hit him like a delayed shock. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably, not from the cold, but from fear, real fear, the kind that strips everything away, ego, pride, illusion. If he had fallen just now, Tien would be waiting for someone who would never come back. The thought pierced through him deeper than anything else. Jack shut his eyes tightly, then exhaled. No, not today. His voice was hoarse, but firm. He straightened the bike slowly, carefully adjusting his grip, forcing his shaking hands to steady. I still have to go home. Meanwhile, back at the small wooden house, Tien stood by the doorway, staring down the mountain path. The sky had darkened too quickly. The rain came harder than expected. And Jack still hadn't returned. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the wooden door. He should have been back by now. A bad feeling grew in her chest. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that everything was fine, but her heart wouldn't listen. Images kept flashing in her mind. The slippery road, the dangerous turns, the fragile old bike. Jack! She stepped outside despite the rain, her eyes scanning the distant path desperately. Nothing. Only fog. Only rain. Only silence. Her breathing became uneven. Please be safe. The journey back felt longer than ever. Every turn was a test. Every second demanded focus. Jack rode slower now, careful, deliberate. The adrenaline from the near accident still lingered in his body, keeping him alert, but also draining his strength. The rain showed no sign of stopping. Water soaked through his clothes, his hands numb from the cold. and the remaining fruits ruined completely. Jack glanced back briefly at the basket. A bitter smile formed on his lips. So, today was a failure. No profit, no success, only exhaustion, and almost losing his life. The old Jack would have called this unacceptable, a disaster, a humiliating defeat. But now, he simply kept writing because something inside him had changed. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about continuing. By the time he reached the village, the sky had already turned dark. The rain softened slightly, but the cold remained. Jack slowed the bike as the familiar outline of the wooden house appeared through the mist. And there, a figure stood in the rain, waiting. Tien! She saw him and immediately ran toward him. Jack! Her voice broke through the quiet like a desperate cry. Jack barely had time to react before she reached him. Are you okay? Why are you so late? I was so worried. Her words stopped abruptly because she saw his face, pale, exhausted, empty. Jack tried to smile, but it came out weak. I'm fine. Before he could say anything else, his body swayed. The tension, the cold, the exhaustion, everything hit him at once. Jack! Tien quickly caught him, wrapping her arms around him as he leaned heavily against her. I almost didn't make it back, he admitted quietly. Her grip tightened instantly. What do you mean? Jack let out a shaky breath. There was a turn. The bike slipped, I thought. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Tien's body froze. Her face turned pale. For a moment, she said nothing. Then suddenly, she hugged him tightly, so tightly that it almost hurt. Don't say that, she whispered, her voice trembling. Don't ever say that. Jack closed his eyes, resting his head against her shoulder. I'm sorry. She shook her head, tears mixing with the rain. No, don't apologize. Just don't leave me like that. They stood there in the rain, holding on to each other like it was the only thing keeping them grounded. After a while, Tien pulled back slightly, looking at him through tear-filled eyes. What about the fruits? Jack glanced at the basket, then back at her. They're gone. A pause. I sold some, but the rest, the rain ruined everything. Silence, heavy, unavoidable. Then Jack forced a small smile. It's okay, he said softly. We'll try again tomorrow. Tien stared at him, confused. How can you say it's okay? She asked, her voice breaking. You almost died. You worked all day and we didn't earn anything. Jack reached out, gently wiping the tears from her face. Because I came back. She froze. He looked at her, his eyes tired but warm. That's enough for me. Her lips trembled. Jack leaned his forehead lightly against hers. And because I still have you. The world seemed to quiet down. Even the rain softened. Jack let out a small breath, then smiled, this time more genuine. Having you by my side, that's enough. That sentence, simple, honest, but it shattered something inside her. Tien couldn't hold it anymore. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest as tears streamed down freely. You idiot, she cried. You almost scared me to death. Jack held her tightly. I know. I don't need money. I don't need anything else, she continued, her voice breaking. I just need you to come back safely, every day. His grip tightened. I will. For a long moment they stood there, holding each other in the rain as if nothing else in the world mattered. No money, no failure, no past. Just this moment. Just them. Later that night, inside the small wooden house, the sound of rain became gentle, almost soothing. Jack sat by the fire, drying his clothes, his body still aching. Across from him, Tien prepared a simple meal, just rice and a bit of leftover vegetables. Nothing special, but warm, real. She placed the bowl in front of him. Eat, she said softly. Jack looked at it, then at her, and smiled. "Looks better than any restaurant I've been to." She rolled her eyes slightly, but a small smile appeared. "Liar." He chuckled, then took a bite, and for some reason, it really did taste better. Outside, the mountains stood silent under the night sky. The storm had passed, but the journey ahead was only just beginning.